This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
My name is Rutherford. I am your instructor in this series of studies on the subject of premillennialism. We've entitled this entire series Millennial Mania to describe what is happening in our world today in regard to premillennialism. But particularly at this time, we're studying a two-part series on Matthew chapter 24. We're now in lesson 7, and we have entitled that Misconceptions of Matthew 24, and this is the second in a two-part study on that chapter. Matthew 24 is a key chapter in our study of premillennialism because premillennialists misapply Matthew 24 in an effort to find signs to warn us that the coming of Christ is very near. As we mentioned before, we're going to see again in this lesson that Jesus is answering two separate questions that was asked by His disciples. The first answer that He gives tells of the signs of the approach of God's judgment upon Jerusalem. And the second answer that He gives makes it clear that there will be no signs of the second coming and of the end of the world. Furthermore, Jesus emphasizes that the destruction of Jerusalem is going to happen within the lifetime of the generation then living, the generation to whom He was speaking, but the second coming of Christ will be sudden and unexpected, and no man knows the day nor the hour. Now, our first major point today that we're going to notice is that the signs in Matthew 24 were fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. I want to repeat that, please. The signs in Matthew 24 were fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Let's turn our attention now to the book of Matthew, chapter 24. I hope you have your Bible handy and that you will open it to that chapter and we will study it together. In Matthew chapter 24 and verse 5, we read first of all that one of the signs is that false Christ would come. False Christ would come, and this would be one of the signs of the destruction of Jerusalem. False Christ would come. And that's found in verse 5. Jesus says, "For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many." Now, there are a number of ancient writers whose writings have come down to us today, and they verify that this is exactly what happened. For example, Josephus, the Jewish historian of the first century, along with Jerome, who lived in the 3rd and 4th centuries, Justin the Martyr in the 2nd century, Irenaeus in the 2nd century, Origen and others, all told of men who came in that period before AD 70 claiming to be the Christ. There are a number of impostors. We, as disciples of Jesus Christ, must always be on our guard and take heed that nobody deceives us. And then in verses 6 and 7, we read that another sign would be that there would be wars and rumors of wars. There would be wars and rumors of wars. Notice, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." Now, today we have the premillennial prognosticators telling us that, oh, there are wars and rumors of war. Well, of course there are. There always have been almost since the beginning of the world, and I'm persuaded will continue to be as long as mankind is upon this earth. But at the time that Jesus made this prophecy, there was peace throughout the Roman world. However, early historians tell us that in the 5-year period immediately before the siege of Jerusalem, the Roman Empire was torn by insurrections within and attacks without. There was a constant cry of war someplace. There were wars and rumors of war. In fact, the whole empire was in disarray. In just one year, in the year 69, 4 different emperors sat on the throne of Rome. Of course, one would supplant another and take power away from him. We know that Jews suffered greatly during this period of time, that there were massacres of thousands of Jews in Alexandria, in Damascus, and in Caesarea. The Jewish revolt that began against Rome in AD 67 continued on until AD 73. And this, of course, was one of those wars and rumors of wars. And then we're told also in the latter part of verse 7, there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. Well, now, premillennialists like to look at our daily newspaper and pick out famines and earthquakes and so forth that happen in our time and say these are signs of the end. There have always been famines and pestilences and earthquakes, and these will continue as long as the world continues, I'm persuaded. That's a part of nature and of living upon this earth. But the Lord here is speaking of a time when there was an unprecedented number of these things. And this was indeed the case in the period immediately before the destruction of Jerusalem. Famine, pestilences, and earthquakes occurred. In the New Testament, in Acts 11, verses 28 and 29, we read of a great famine which came to all the world in the days of Claudius Caesar. And then history tells us that there was a plague in Rome during the days of the Emperor Nero. And Nero ruled in the 650s and 60s. There was a plague that killed more than 30,000 people. Both Josephus, the Jewish historian, and Tacitus, a Roman historian, tell of plagues that ravaged various parts of the Roman Empire during this period of time. And earthquakes were very severe during this period of time, and there were many of them. There was an earthquake in the year AD 54, the year that, and the very day, in fact, it occurred, that Nero became the emperor. And some took this to be a bad omen, and it may have been because Nero proved to be a very bad emperor. The city of Laodicea was destroyed in AD 60 by an earthquake. Pompeii, that was destroyed later in 79, was hit by an earthquake in 63. Rome was shaken by an earthquake in 68. And during this period of time, immediately prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, there were earthquakes in Crete, Smyrna, Chios, Miletus, Samos, Hierapolis, Colossae, and Campania. In fact, Josephus said that there were so many of these earthquakes that it was a sign of impending destruction upon mankind. Well, there was impending destruction, not upon mankind in general, but upon the Jews, and particularly the Jews in Jerusalem. But then verses 9 and 10 tell us that a general persecution would come upon the people of God. Verses 9 and 10 tell us that a general persecution would come upon the people of God. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Do you remember back in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus had warned of persecution that would come to His disciples. He pointed out that they would betray, or people would betray you. He pointed out that a father would be against his own children and the children against their own father because of discipleship, because of following Him. That one would be hated of all men, even they of his own household, and so on. Well, now we're reading about it again. But you know, throughout the New Testament, we're warned that living the Christian life is not going to be easy. Paul said, all that would live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. 1 Timothy 3 and verse 12. In Acts 14 and 22, Paul and Barnabas, revisiting the churches they had established on their first missionary journey, warned them that through much tribulation we must enter the kingdom of God. And we know from reading the early chapters of the book of Acts that the church in Jerusalem and Judea was periodically persecuted by the Jews. We know that Nero instituted a persecution against the Jews in Rome in AD 64. We know from history that both Peter and Paul gave their lives as a result of their testimony for Jesus Christ. and some books of the New Testament, such as the book of 1 Peter, were written against a background of persecution against the church. And so there was certainly plenty of persecution against the people of God in the period immediately preceding the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Then verse 11 gives us another sign. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. False prophets would come. Well, false prophets would seek to lead many astray. This would be a sign of the destruction of Jerusalem. But we shouldn't be surprised at this. There have always been false prophets. They abound today. And quite frankly, I would put the premillennialists of today in the category of those who are present-day false prophets. But our Lord Jesus Christ Himself had warned that false prophets would come. You remember in Matthew chapter 7, He said, beware of false prophets who shall come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Matthew 7 and verse 15. They appear to be good and kind and pious and spiritual, but they have a desire to ravage you and to tear you apart. And remember that Paul, meeting with the elders of the church at Ephesus, at Miletus, had warned them that savage wolves would enter in among them, not sparing the flock, and from among their own selves would men arise, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after them. So that was another sign, but still another sign of the destruction of Jerusalem would be in verses 12 and 13. Some Christians would become lukewarm and indifferent, and some would fall away. Some Christians would become lukewarm. Notice, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will wax cold, or grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. Now, can you imagine, with all this persecution, how very difficult it would be for one to maintain his faith if he's being persecuted even by members of his own family, his neighbors, his fellow countrymen? It would be very easy to give up the faith under those conditions. In the parable of the sower, Jesus pointed out that the stony soil represented those hearers who heard the word and with joy received it, but because of persecution or troubles, when these came, they would fall away. And so many would fall away during those trying conditions. There were very trying conditions before the destruction of Jerusalem, which resulted in lukewarmness. The book of Hebrews is a good case in point. The book of Hebrews was written before the destruction of Jerusalem, and in it there are a number of references to the coming destruction, I believe. But in that book we see a group of Christians who have been Christians for a considerable period of time, but they have become indifferent. And because of their apathy, their indifference, they are in danger of falling away. Now, friends, there's a lesson for us in that today. It's easy to become complacent as a Christian. It's easy to become so complacent that one becomes lukewarm, that he leaves his first love, that he loses his fervor, his desire to serve the Lord, and Christianity becomes something rote that he just goes through because he feels like he's got to do it, and he does it mindlessly without any real conviction. Eventually, people like that will fall away. Well, Jesus is saying in the period before the destruction of Jerusalem, you'll see many become lukewarm, apathetic, indifferent, and this will be a sign of the approaching end. And then another sign of the approaching end would be a good sign as far as Christianity is concerned. The gospel would be preached to the whole world before the destruction of Jerusalem. The gospel would be preached to the whole world. Look at verse 14, if you will. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Now, some of the most zealous missionaries I've ever known are people who have premillennial convictions. And I used to wonder why that was so, but I think this is the reason for it. They see verse 14 and they believe that They've got to preach the gospel to the whole world, the gospel as they understand it, in order to bring on the second coming of Christ and the end of all things. But the Lord isn't speaking of His second coming here. He's telling them the things that are going to take place before Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, and one of them is that the gospel will be preached in all the world as a witness, and then the end will come. Now, did that actually happen? Was the gospel preached to all the world? Well, in Romans chapter 1 and verse 8, Paul spoke of the great faith of the Church of Rome, and he said it was spoken of throughout all the world. And then in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 23, Paul speaks of the hope of the gospel. He says, whereof I, Paul, was made a minister. And he says that gospel was preached to every creature under heaven. Now those are the words of the Apostle Paul. Again, Romans chapter 10 indicates also that their sound went out to all the earth, and their words unto the end of the world. And so the gospel was very widely dispersed over the earth in the period prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. We have recorded for us mostly the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. And we can relate with Paul, and we think Paul was truly a great man and a great evangelist, and indeed he was. But you know, Paul wasn't the only apostle. While he was busy, the other apostles, no doubt, were just as busy carrying the gospel to other parts of the world. But the Holy Spirit selected one to record for us, but the others were all active and busy as well during the same period of time, and they were working in other areas of the world. Now, another sign of the destruction of Jerusalem would be the presence of the abomination of desolation. In fact, the abomination of desolation would be the immediate sign of the coming destruction of Jerusalem. Notice, if you will, verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Do you understand? Well, we want you to, and we're going to try to understand that in just a moment here. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and so on. So the warning is to flee, and they were to flee when they saw the abomination of desolation that had been spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Well, Daniel the prophet prophesied long before the coming of Jesus Christ, and he foretold this coming of the abomination of desolation. But, you know, we really don't have to go back to Daniel to learn what it is. We can learn what it is in the New Testament by going over to the parallel passage in Luke chapter 20 and in verse 21. And in Luke 20 and verse 21, a parallel passage speaking of the destruction of Jerusalem, notice this. Then, I'm sorry, I must have the wrong reference here. Luke 20 and verse 21. It may be 21 and verse 20. Ah, yes, it is, 21 and verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Now notice Matthew refers to the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, and then Luke speaks of the same thing, but he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. So the abomination of desolation is the surrounding of the city of Jerusalem by armies. But how's that an abomination? Well, the Roman army was made up of men from all over the empire who were idol worshippers. And we are told by historians that the Roman soldiers had the images of the eagle, which they worshipped and which was the emblem for Rome, and they had images also of the Roman emperor on their shields. Now they worshipped the emperor and they worshipped the eagle as an emblem of Rome. They actually worshiped the Roman state. They worshiped these emblems, and therefore they were guilty of idolatry, which is an abomination in the sight of God. Josephus tells us that after Jerusalem had been taken, the soldiers came in and burned the temple, and then they burned incense to their weapons of war. Notice, this quotation from Josephus. And now the Romans, upon the burning of the holy house itself, and of all the buildings round about it, brought their shields to the temple, and set them over against its eastern gate, and there they did offer sacrifices to them. And so the Roman army, an army made up of idol worshippers, was the abomination of desolation. Luke's account makes it very clear. Jerusalem, surrounded by armies, was the abomination of desolation. And so the Christians are being told, or the disciples of Jesus are being told, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you know that its destruction is very, very near. Now, the destruction of Jerusalem was foretold by Daniel the prophet, and we want to go back to the book of Daniel, chapter 9, and read verses 24 to 27. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. Daniel had been praying to God, confessing the sins of himself and his people, and while he was praying, the angel Gabriel was sent to him to give him a message. And the message was that 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again and the wall, even in troublesome times. And after 62 weeks Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the Prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood, and till the end of the war desolations are determined. And we could read on about that. Well, we'll read verse 27. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. May I suggest to you that what we have here is a history of Jerusalem that was going to take place. The 70 weeks would be from the time of the decree of Cyrus, king of the Medes and the Persians, to rebuild Jerusalem. Daniel was prophesying during that time under the completion of the walls by Nehemiah. And then, that would be the 7 weeks. And then the 62 weeks would be from the time of the rebuilding of the walls until the coming of Jesus Christ. The coming of Christ until the destruction of Jerusalem would be represented by the 1 week. Thus, Daniel's prophecy covered the final history of Jerusalem from its rebuilding following the decree of Cyrus until its destruction at the hands of the Romans in AD 70. And all that has been fulfilled. It's not yet future or yet to be fulfilled. Now notice this, if you will. Jesus' disciples must flee the city when they see the approach of the Roman army. Jesus' disciples must flee the city when they see the approach of the Roman army. The Roman army began the siege of Jerusalem in AD 67. The Roman army began the siege of Jerusalem and then suddenly withdrew briefly to Caesarea. Let's notice that again. The Roman army began the siege of Jerusalem and then suddenly withdrew. Now that's interesting. I believe that was providential. It was during this brief interval that the Christians who lived in Jerusalem remembered the Lord's words in Matthew 24, and they remembered to do what He told them to do. They fled. History tells us they fled to Pella, a city in the mountains east of the Jordan River, where they did not have to experience the anguish of the siege, although of course they still suffered much. History records the events concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. For some reason, the siege began and then it withdrew. The Christians fled, and then sometime thereafter the siege was started again. The Roman general Vespasian was the one who led the siege. After he was called to Rome to become the emperor, he turned the completion of the siege over to his son Titus, who took command of his armies and completed it. The siege of Jerusalem lasted for 134 days, but on August the 10th in the year AD 70, the walls were finally broken through and the city was taken. Now, history tells us the sad story that more than 1 million people died during this period of time. In the siege itself, from being killed in battle, or from starvation or disease, and then in the final battle when the Romans broke in, and they were so angry and so had such pent-up emotion after 134 days of besieging the city that they went wild, it appears, and ravaged the city and killed everything that moved. 97,000, however, did survive, but these 97,000 were sold into slavery. If you want to read something interesting and intriguing and yet very sad and a little bit hard to read and take, read Josephus' Wars of the Jews, and read what he has to say about the events of the destruction of Jerusalem. But even though more than 1 million people died and 97 were taken captive, according to the early Christian historian Eusebius, not a single Christian perished in the destruction of Jerusalem, because the Christians heeded the warning the Lord had given in this chapter. Now, the warnings to flee prove that the destruction of Jerusalem, not the end of the world, is under consideration in these verses. The warnings to flee prove that the destruction of Jerusalem, not the end of the world, is under consideration in these verses. Let's notice verses 16, those that are in Judea, let him flee to the mountains. He who is on the housetop, don't go down to take anything out. Don't get your clothes. Woe to those that are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray that your flight is not in winter or on the Sabbath. Well, why? If it were talking about the second coming of the Lord, these things wouldn't make any sense. The second coming of Christ, it's pointless to warn a person not to go down into his house to take anything out, or the one who's in the field to return and get his clothes. All these things are going to be destroyed. It's pointless to give a warning concerning women who are pregnant or who are nursing babies, or to be concerned as to whether it be in the winter, on the Sabbath. All that would be pointless if this has reference to the second coming of Christ. But if it has reference to the destruction of Jerusalem, it makes a lot of sense. If a man is on his housetop, he needs to flee. He needs to get out while he can. He doesn't have time to do anything else. The same is true with a man who's working in his field. He needs to flee in haste and not go back and get caught in the city and not be able to escape. And women who were pregnant would have difficulty in traveling. Women who were nursing babies would be hindered also in their travel. It would be much more difficult for them. If it were in the winter time, it would be difficult to travel because the roads would be, some of them, impassable probably. The going would certainly be harder. If it were on the Sabbath day, they would be hindered by the fact that the gates of the city were closed on that day, and traffic in and out was not allowed, and the Jews were forbidden to travel on the Sabbath more than what was called a Sabbath day's journey, which was less than 2 miles. So Jesus says, pray that the siege doesn't happen, doesn't begin on these occasions, because it's going to be difficult. Verse 21 speaks of great tribulation. There will be great tribulation such as not been since the beginning of time until this time, nor shall ever be. Well, the premillennialists speak of a period of great tribulation. While the saints are raptured in heaven, there's going to be tribulation on this earth. Well, great tribulation, now get this point please, great tribulation came upon souls trapped in Jerusalem. Great tribulation came upon souls who were trapped in Jerusalem during its siege and overflow, and the Christians who escaped also suffered, but certainly not as greatly as those who were trapped in the city. But premillennialists say that this refers to what they call the Great Tribulation. This is a period of time when the saints have been raptured away to heaven by the Lord, and the Antichrist is ruling upon this earth, and he turns against the Jews who have been converted to the Lord and persecutes them and other Jews mercilessly, and that persecution is the most severe that has ever come. But friends, that's not what Jesus is talking about. That's completely taken out of context here. Jesus is talking about the suffering that took place in the destruction of Jerusalem. According to historians, conditions were so severe that starvation was so severe that mothers ate their own children. The Jews fought against each other as they fought against the Romans, and it was just a terrible, unbelievable picture. And Josephus, who was an eyewitness of all this, relates it in his history, which has come down to us. During this period of time, false Christs would come and false prophets. They were not to be deceived by them and their claims, because Jesus said when He comes again, it's going to be like the lightning that comes from the east and flashes unto the west. Then in verses 29 to 31, we have a passage that some people find very difficult. They want to apply it to the second coming of Christ, not only premillennialists but others. But they make a mistake here because they do not understand the kind of language that Jesus is using to paint this picture of His destruction on Jerusalem. May I submit to you that verses 29 through 31 are not speaking of the second coming of Christ. They're still speaking of the destruction of Jerusalem. Notice, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory. And then He will send His angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together His elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. Now Jesus here is using what is called apocalyptic language. This is the type of language in which the book of Revelation is written. Listen to this, please. Apocalyptic language is highly figurative speech which employs bigger-than-life symbols such as the sun, moon, and stars to represent individuals, governments, and nations. Apocalyptic language is highly figurative speech which employs bigger-than-life symbols such as sun, moon, and stars to represent individuals, governments, and nations. And that's what's being done here. Jesus is just trying to describe how awesome His judgment of the city is going to be. He's speaking of Himself as coming in judgment. You find this type of language in the Old Testament when we read of God's judgment upon the nations in ancient times. For example, in Isaiah 13, there's a similar picture painted using apocalyptic literature to picture the fall of Babylon. Again in Isaiah 19, we read of the Lord coming in judgment on a cloud upon the nation of Egypt. Ezekiel 32 and verse 7 uses apocalyptic language to describe the defeat of Egypt on another occasion. But friends, when Jerusalem fell, Judaism as a system was gone. When Jerusalem fell, Judaism as a system was completely gone. Notice verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. That signifies the sun has set upon Judaism and the Jewish nation. The moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the power of the heavens will be shaken. On that occasion, the worship in the temple ceased forever. The priesthood no longer functioned. All the genealogical records of the Jews were destroyed in the destruction of Jerusalem, so that, strictly speaking, Jerusalem can never exist as a nation in the sense that it did before. There's no man living today who can prove, beyond an intimation of a shadow of a doubt, that he's a Jew or that he's of any certain Jewish tribe. They can't know which tribe is the priestly tribe. All those records were destroyed in the destruction of Jerusalem. And therefore it would be impossible to have a nation where the old priesthood and the old worship was restored, such as the premillennialists tell us is going to happen. The Lord came figuratively in the clouds to judge Judaism in the destruction of Jerusalem. Now when He speaks of is sending His angels forth to gather people from the four corners of the earth, understand the meaning of the word angel. The word angel simply means messenger. That's our word angel comes from angelos, the Greek word which is transliterated as angel, but it means a messenger. Gospel preachers are messengers of God as they go out to carry God's message, the gospel. And I believe what he's speaking of here is a great gospel harvest, when preachers of the gospel were free to go to all the world and preach the gospel and bring in souls. You see, when Jerusalem was destroyed, there was a complete separation made in the minds of the people between the Lord's church and the Jewish nation. It was clear to the Romans and to others that this was the case. The opposition of the Jews who had persecuted the Christians so greatly in the early decades of Christianity was now removed. The Jews were not able to do that any longer. And as a result, there was a great burst of evangelism. And there was great growth in the church as preachers went out uninhibited to the four corners of the earth to take the gospel everywhere. Now Jesus closes with a parable here of the fig tree. He says, "Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and put forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the very door." All right, this is what we've had so far. We've had a description of the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, in verse 36 and following, we find the second coming of Christ is described. The second coming of Christ is described. A clear transition is made at verse 36. A clear transition is made at verse 36. Jesus says, "But of that day and that hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels in heaven, but my Father only." Before this, signs had been given to know when the approach of Jerusalem, of the destruction of Jerusalem was coming, but now no signs are given because of that day and that hour no one knows. No one knows the time of the Lord's return. No one knows the time of the Lord's return. The angels do not know. The Son, when He was on this earth, did not know. Only the Father in His infinite wisdom knew. But what we can know is that the return of Christ will be sudden and unexpected. The return of Christ will be sudden and unexpected. It'll take people by surprise as the great flood did. And when the Lord comes again, we must be ready to meet Him. If we're not ready, then of course we will perish eternally. As we come to the conclusion of this study, let us notice now that Matthew chapter 24 answers two questions. Number one, the question is, what would be the signs of the Lord's coming in judgment upon Jerusalem? And number two, what would be the signs of His coming to judge the world at the last day? The Lord gives a number of signs by which they may know the approaching destruction of Jerusalem, but of His coming no signs are given. He tells us to watch, for in an hour that we think not, the Son of Man is coming.